What if I told you that the Cold War was far more than just a political standoff between two superpowers? What if I told you that behind the scenes, there were unspeakable and horrifying things happening that nobody knows about? In this video, we will dive into the unspeakable things that happened during the Cold War. Don't forget to click subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this. Do you want to know more about this? Enjoy the video. The Cold War was a period of political and military tension between the Western powers, led by the United States, and the Eastern powers, led by the Soviet Union, that lasted from the end of World War II in 1945 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. During the Cold War, the two superpowers engaged in a global struggle for influence, with each side promoting their respective political and economic ideologies. The US advocated for capitalism and democracy, while the Soviet Union championed communism and state ownership of the means of production. The main players in the Cold War were the United States and the Soviet Union, along with their respective allies and clients. The US led the Western Alliance, which included countries in Europe, Asia, and Latin America, while the Soviet Union led the Eastern Bloc, which consisted of Eastern European countries and communist states in Asia and Africa. The Cold War had a profound impact on world history and shaped international relations for decades to come. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union ran secret programs aimed at developing biological and chemical weapons. These programs often involved unethical and inhumane practices with little regard for the safety and well-being of the individuals involved. One of the most well-known US programs was Project MK-Ultra, a covert operation run by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, from the 1950s to the 1970s. The goal of the project was to develop mind control techniques using a variety of methods, including the administration of drugs like LSD, electroconvulsive therapy, and hypnosis. The CIA conducted these experiments on unwitting subjects, including prisoners, mental patients, and other vulnerable populations. One of the most infamous MK-Ultra experiments involved the drug-induced interrogation of Frank Olson, a U.S. Army biochemist who worked for the CIA. In 1953, Olson was given LSD without his knowledge or consent, and shortly afterwards he plunged to his death from the 13th floor of a New York City hotel. His death was officially ruled a suicide, but his family later received a settlement from the U.S. government and an apology from President Gerald Ford. The Soviet Union also had its own secret biological and chemical weapons program, which was run by the KGB and the Soviet military. This program was known as Biopreparat, and it involved the production and testing of deadly pathogens like anthrax, smallpox, and plague. The Soviet Union allegedly stockpiled these weapons in the event of a conflict with the US or other countries. One of the most notorious incidents involving Biopreparat occurred in 1979, when an accidental release of anthrax spores from a Soviet research facility in the city of Sverdlovsk caused a deadly outbreak of the disease. According to official Soviet reports, 64 people died from the outbreak, but some experts believe the death toll was much higher. Overall, the secret programs run by the US and USSR to develop biological and chemical weapons during the Cold War were a dark and disturbing chapter in human history. They highlight the dangers of unchecked government power and the importance of ethical principles and human rights in scientific research. The Cold War was marked by numerous covert operations and coups carried out by both the United States and the Soviet Union, often with disastrous consequences for the countries involved. These interventions were often motivated by the desire to spread or contain communism, to protect economic or strategic interests, or to maintain influence over key regions of the world. One of the most well-known U.S. covert operations was the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Iran in 1953, which was orchestrated by the CIA and the British intelligence agency MI6. The operation, known as Operation Ajax, was intended to remove Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh from power after he nationalized the country's oil industry, which had been controlled by foreign interests. The CIA worked with Iranian agents and anti-Mossadegh groups to foment protests and strikes, and ultimately to install Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi as the new leader of Iran. This led to decades of authoritarian rule, human rights abuses, and political instability in Iran, which continue to reverberate to this day. The Soviet Union also engaged in numerous covert operations and interventions during the Cold War, often in support of communist or socialist governments or movements around the world. One of the most significant of these was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, which was carried out in support of the Afghan communist government, which had been facing increasing opposition from Islamic militants. The Soviet Union sent troops and supplies to Afghanistan, but faced a protracted and bloody conflict against the Afghan resistance, known as the Mujahideen. The conflict lasted for nearly a decade, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 1 million Afghan civilians and the displacement of millions more. The conflict also had wider geopolitical consequences, as the US and its allies provided support to the Afghan resistance, and the conflict was seen as a key factor in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Other notable covert operations and coups carried out during the Cold War include the US's involvement in the overthrow of Guatemala's democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz in 1954, the CIA's attempted assassination of Cuba's Fidel Castro in the 1960s, and the Soviet Union's support for leftist guerrillas in various Latin American countries. These interventions often had long-lasting and devastating consequences for the countries involved, including political repression, economic turmoil, and violence. The Cold War was marked by numerous disasters and accidents that occurred around the world, many of which had long-lasting and devastating consequences for the people and communities affected. While some of these disasters and accidents have become well known, such as the Chernobyl disaster, others remain relatively obscure despite their significance. One of the most terrifying near disasters of the Cold War occurred in 1961, when a B-52 bomber carrying 2 nuclear bombs crashed near Goldsboro, North Carolina. The bombs were supposed to be released in the event of a war with the Soviet Union, but due to a series of malfunctions, the bombs were nearly detonated on American soil. One of the bombs broke apart on impact, spreading radioactive material over a wide area, while the other remained largely intact. It was only through a combination of luck and human error that a nuclear explosion was averted, but the incident highlighted the dangers posed by the massive nuclear arsenals of the US and the Soviet Union. Another little-known disaster of the Cold War occurred in 1968, when a Soviet submarine carrying nuclear weapons sank in the North Pacific. The submarine, known as the K-129, was lost with all hands, and the Soviet Union launched a massive search and rescue operation. The US, however, was able to locate the wreckage using advanced sonar technology and subsequently conducted a covert operation to recover the submarine and its nuclear missiles. The operation, known as Project Azorian, was one of the most ambitious and expensive espionage operations in US history and was only declassified in the 1990s. The Chernobyl disaster, which occurred in 1986, remains one of the most well-known and devastating accidents of the Cold War era. The disaster, which occurred at a nuclear power plant in Ukraine, was caused by a combination of design flaws and human error and resulted in a massive explosion and fire. The explosion released radioactive material into the atmosphere, contaminating a wide area and causing significant health and environmental impacts. Thousands of people died or suffered from radiation sickness, and the disaster contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Other little-known disasters and accidents of the Cold War era include the 1957 Windscale fire, which occurred at a nuclear reactor in the UK, the 1979 Three Mile Island accident in the US, and the 1991 Gulf War oil spill, which was caused by the deliberate release of oil by the Iraqi army. Each of these incidents had significant impacts on the environment and on the health and well-being of the people and communities affected. The Cold War had significant environmental consequences, as both the United States and the Soviet Union pursued military and geopolitical strategies that often prioritized national security over environmental protection. One example of this is the US military's use of the herbicide Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange was a toxic chemical compound that was sprayed over large areas of Vietnam in an effort to destroy enemy crops and vegetation. However, the herbicide had significant and long-lasting impacts on the environment and on the health of people and wildlife in the affected areas. Agent Orange contained dioxin, a highly toxic chemical that has been linked to cancer, birth defects, and other serious health problems. It also caused widespread deforestation and soil degradation, which had long-term environmental consequences for the region. The Soviet Union also had a poor environmental record during the Cold War, particularly in relation to nuclear waste disposal. The Soviet government dumped large quantities of nuclear waste into the Arctic Ocean in an effort to hide the waste and avoid accountability for its nuclear weapons program. This dumping had serious environmental consequences, contaminating marine life and posing health risks for people living in the region. In addition, the Soviet Union carried out extensive nuclear testing, which had significant environmental impacts and caused widespread radiation contamination. Both the US and the Soviet Union were also heavily involved in the global arms race, which had significant environmental consequences. The production and testing of nuclear weapons, for example, produced large amounts of radioactive waste and pollution, which had long-term environmental impacts. In addition, the construction of military bases and other infrastructure often involved environmental destruction and disruption, as forests were cleared, rivers were dammed, and ecosystems were altered. Overall, the Cold War had significant environmental consequences, many of which are still being felt today. While some efforts have been made to address these environmental issues, much more needs to be done to mitigate the damage caused by Cold War-era policies and practices. I hope this video is productive for you all. Thanks for watching the video, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more videos.